Daniel and Clara Hargreaves were the perfect couple, until one stormy night when she vanished, and 10 years later, the woman he was convicted of killing walked into his prison cell alive. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Ashcombe sat quietly in the heart of the English countryside, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else's story, or at least they thought they did. Rows of stone cottages lined narrow cobbled streets, their chimneys sending thin curls of smoke into the misty morning air. Children played on the green, elderly men chatted outside the bakery, and secrets rarely lasted long in a place that small. But no one ever suspected that behind one of those neat little doors, something truly dark was growing. Daniel Hargreaves had lived in Ashcombe for nearly 15 years. He was an architect, known for his calm voice and tidy appearance. His house, a red brick building at the edge of the village, looked like something out of a home magazine: trimmed hedges, white shutters, a perfectly painted front door. His wife, Clara, was the heart of the community. She taught art at the local school and was beloved by her students. To neighbors, they were the picture of a happy English couple, the kind others quietly compared themselves to. But appearances can lie. Behind the walls of that perfect home, the Hargreaves' marriage was falling apart. Friends noticed subtle changes first: Clara smiling less at village gatherings, Daniel becoming distant, his once charming tone now sharp and impatient. Money problems had crept in after Daniel lost a major client. The financial strain grew heavier when whispers began that Clara might have been spending too much time with one of her colleagues. No one dared to say it aloud, but gossip spread quickly in Ashcombe and Daniel heard every word. He began to change in ways that frightened Clara. He drank more. He worked late into the night, or at least claimed to. Some nights she heard him pacing downstairs, muttering to himself. She wanted to leave, but she had nowhere to go. Her parents were gone, and she didn't want to face the humiliation of becoming the subject of village talk. So she stayed, pretending things were fine, painting smiles over the cracks. By the autumn of 2012, their relationship had become a tense silence broken only by small explosions. Arguments about bills, dinners gone cold, unspoken resentment building like storm clouds. Clara started sleeping in the guest room. Neighbors later recalled hearing loud noises one night, though no one could say exactly when. Most brushed it off as just another quarrel. Yet there were moments when Daniel seemed almost desperate to make things right. He would buy her flowers, cook her breakfast, even talk about taking a trip to the coast. But the gestures felt hollow, forced, as if he were trying to convince himself that everything was normal. Inside, something was breaking: his pride, his patience, maybe even his sanity. Ashcombe, in its quiet perfection, had no idea what was coming. No one knew that within weeks, one of their most admired couples would vanish from their peaceful routines and become the center of one of the most haunting mysteries the village would ever face. The truth was already there, buried in that lovely brick home, waiting, silent, just beneath the surface of ordinary life. When the young couple, James and Ellie Turner, bought the old Hargreaves house in 2022, they saw it as a dream come true, an affordable cottage with character, surrounded by a quiet garden and overlooking the woods. The house had a shadowed history, but they didn't mind. 10 years had passed since Clara Hargreaves' disappearance, and in Ashcombe, people had learned to speak of it only in hushed tones. To James and Ellie, the past didn't matter. They wanted a fresh start. For the first few months, everything was peaceful. They repainted the rooms, replaced the worn-out furniture, and began restoring the garden, which had grown wild with weeds. It was during that restoration that everything changed. One warm April afternoon, James decided to clear the area near the old wooden shed at the back of the property. The ground there was uneven, and an odd section of cement caught his eye. A rough, patchy slab that didn't match the rest of the paving stones. At first, he thought it was just a botched bit of old DIY. But the shape was strange, too wide and oddly placed, almost as if it was hiding something. He fetched a hammer and started breaking it apart. Within minutes, A foul, earthy smell filled the air, and what looked like a fragment of cloth appeared beneath the cement. When the first hint of bones surfaced, James froze. The police were called immediately, and by nightfall the quiet street was filled with flashing blue light. Forensic teams worked through the night, carefully removing layers of soil until they uncovered the full truth: human remains wrapped in what had once been a bedsheet. The discovery shocked everyone. Some villagers gathered outside the gate, whispering prayers and clutching their coats against the cold. The next morning, the police confirmed what many had feared for a decade. The remains belonged to Clara Hargreaves. News of the discovery spread across the country. Reporters flooded Ashcombe, cameras flashing, journalists shouting questions no one wanted to answer. For those who remembered Clara, the grief was raw again. People spoke about how kind she'd been, how her art classes had brightened the lives of children, and how tragic it was that she'd been found this way, hidden in the garden she once tended with love. Investigators quickly turned their attention to Daniel Hargreaves, who had moved away years earlier. They uncovered records showing that just days before Clara vanished, Daniel had bought several bags of cement and a new shovel. A local hardware store owner remembered his calmness that day, even joking with him about doing serious home improvement. It was chilling in hindsight. The evidence was undeniable. The remains, the purchase records, and traces of Clara's belongings all pointed to one man. The perfect husband who once charmed everyone in Ashcombe had buried his wife beneath his own garden and gone on living as if nothing had happened. What he thought would remain hidden forever was now uncovered, piece by piece, as the soil gave up its terrible secret. The trial of Daniel Hargreaves began in the spring of 2023, 10 years after Clara's disappearance, and months after her remains were found. The courtroom in Bristol was packed each day with journalists, townspeople, and even curious strangers who had followed the case from the beginning. The once respected architect now sat in the dock, pale and expressionless, his hair graying and his hands trembling slightly as the charges were read aloud. The nation was gripped by the story of the man who had lived among them, seemingly ordinary while hiding a terrible crime in his own backyard. The prosecution built a case that was both detailed and devastating. They presented receipts showing Daniel's purchase of cement, tarps, and tools just days before Clara vanished. They showed photos of the bloodstains found in the bedroom, faint but undeniable, discovered beneath layers of old carpet. Forensic experts confirmed that the DNA matched Clara's. Then came the most haunting evidence of all: the necklace found near her remains, a silver chain with a small heart pendant that Clara had been wearing the night she disappeared. It was bent and broken, as if torn away in a struggle. Witnesses from Ashcombe were called to testify. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices on the night Clara went missing, though no one had thought much of it at the time. One elderly woman described seeing Daniel carrying something heavy to the garden early the next morning. She had assumed it was building materials, not the body of his wife. The image of that moment, a man moving calmly through the dawn, burying his secret under layers of concrete, became one of the most chilling details of the case. The defense tried to offer an explanation that could save him. They claimed Daniel had found Clara dead after an accident, that she had fallen down the stairs during an argument, and he panicked. He buried her, they said, not out of cruelty but out of fear. But the medical examiner's report shattered that claim. Clara's skull had been fractured in a way consistent with blunt force trauma from a heavy object, not a fall. The injuries suggested violence, not misfortune. Throughout the proceedings, Daniel remained silent. He didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't show regret. He simply sat and listened, eyes fixed on the floor, while his life was dissected in front of strangers. Some thought he was cold and remorseless. Others believed he was broken beyond repair. When the final day came, the courtroom was silent as the jury delivered their verdict, guilty of murder. Daniel was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The judge called his actions a deliberate and calculated attempt to erase a life and deceive a community. As he was led away, reporters shouted his name, but he didn't look back. The man once admired for his calm and charm had become a symbol of betrayal and evil. In Ashcombe, people watched the news with disbelief. The red brick house on the edge of the village stood empty again, its garden sealed off and its windows dark. Some said they could still feel something heavy in the air around it. The weight of guilt, the echo of Clara's silence, and the reminder that even in a peaceful English village, horror can live quietly behind a smiling face. Prison life changed Daniel Hargreaves completely. The man who once wore tailored suits and designed luxury homes now woke up every morning to the sound of metal doors clanging and guards shouting orders. He was assigned to a small cell in HMP Wandsworth, where the walls were stained and the air carried the smell of damp concrete. Gone was the calm, confident architect from Ashcombe. In his place stood a hollow figure who rarely spoke and seemed to have given up on life. Other inmates noticed how he kept to himself, avoiding fights, meals, and even conversations. Some said he was scared, others whispered that he was haunted. The first few years passed in silence. Daniel refused interviews from journalists, ignored letters from strangers, and never attended group therapy sessions offered by the prison counselors. The few who worked with him described him as polite but detached, moving like a man stuck somewhere between guilt and disbelief. At night he barely slept. Guards reported that he often sat on his bunk staring at the wall, whispering things no one could make out. A few said they heard him apologizing softly into the darkness. By the 5th year of his sentence, rumors began to circulate among inmates. Some swore they heard footsteps echoing in the corridor long after lights out, slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped right outside Daniel's cell. The guards brushed it off as stories meant to scare new prisoners, but Daniel seemed to believe it. Each time the sound came, he froze. He told a chaplain once that he felt someone watching him, someone who wanted him to remember. The chaplain tried to comfort him, saying that guilt often plays tricks on the mind, but Daniel's expression never changed. He simply nodded and walked away. Outside the prison, time moved on. Clara's story became another tragic episode in the long list of true crime documentaries and newspaper features. The house in Ashcombe remained empty, its garden overgrown again. The villagers eventually stopped talking about it. Some even said Daniel had paid for his sins and should be left alone, but inside those prison walls the story refused to end. 10 years into his sentence, Daniel's health began to decline. He had lost weight, his hair had turned completely white, and his eyes carried the look of a man who had seen something far worse than prison. One guard, new to the block, described an unsettling moment during his night shift. As he passed Daniel's cell, he saw him standing in the dark, facing the small barred window. Daniel's lips were moving, but there was no sound. When the guard asked what he was doing, Daniel turned and said quietly, "She's here." No one took it seriously. They assumed he was losing his mind, consumed by guilt and loneliness. But a few weeks later, something strange happened. Daniel began to request visits. For 10 years he had refused everyone. Yet now he insisted someone wanted to see him, someone the staff couldn't identify. The paperwork was incomplete, but Daniel kept saying her name, Clara. The guards thought it was another delusion, just another symptom of his decaying mind. What they didn't know was that soon, the impossible would become real. It was a gray morning in February 2033 when the officers at HMP Wandsworth received an unusual visitor request. A woman had arrived at the gate asking to see Daniel Hargreaves. The name she wrote on the visitor form stopped the guard cold. Clara Hargreaves. At first they thought it was some kind of sick joke. The guard even double-checked the name, expecting her to laugh or correct herself, but she didn't. The woman stood calmly, loading her identification and a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked to be in her late 40s, with pale skin and the same small birthmark beneath her right eye that had once been mentioned in every missing person report a decade earlier. Word spread quickly through the prison. The man who had supposedly murdered and buried his wife was about to receive a visit from her. Senior officers, thinking it was a case of mistaken identity, contacted local police before allowing her inside. But every background check came back clean. Her passport, driver's license, and even her fingerprints matched those of the woman believed to be dead. The impossible had become undeniable. After hours of hesitation and security checks, they finally agreed to let her in. When Clara walked through the visiting hall, guards and inmates alike fell silent. There was something eerie about her presence, not ghostly, but unsettling in a way that made people stare. Her movements were calm, deliberate, almost as if she had rehearsed every step. She wore a plain gray coat, her hair tied neatly back, and she asked for nothing but a few minutes to see her husband. Daniel was called from his cell, confused and weak from years of isolation. When he entered the visiting area and saw her sitting behind the glass, he froze, his face turned pale, and for the first time in years his mask of emptiness cracked. The guards watching said he didn't speak at all. He just stood there gripping the table until his knuckles turned white. Clara didn't move either. She looked at him steadily, her expression unreadable, her eyes cold but not angry. It was as if she was studying him, making sure he was real. Outside the prison, chaos erupted. Reporters swarmed the gates, demanding answers. News channels cut their regular programming to cover the shocking headline: Clara Hargreaves, presumed dead, visits husband in prison. People everywhere were stunned. Social media filled with wild theories. Some said it was a hoax. Others claimed it was a ghost, or a cruel prank by someone who resembled her. But DNA tests conducted by police confirmed the truth that no one could explain. The woman was indeed Clara. Officials reopened the case immediately, trying to understand how a woman declared dead and identified through forensics could be standing alive. Clara, however, refused interviews. She wouldn't speak to journalists or detectives. The only thing she said was that she wanted to see Daniel one more time. When asked why, she gave no answer. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. When she left, Daniel sat motionless, staring at the chair where she'd been. Later that night, he whispered something to the guard who brought him his meal. She came back. No one could explain it. The man who had been branded a murderer now faced a reality that defied reason. The woman he was convicted of killing had walked through the prison gates, as if she had returned from the dead. And yet, deep inside him, Daniel knew this was only the beginning of something far darker, a truth that had waited 10 long years to reveal itself. The revelation that the woman who visited Daniel was truly Clara Hargreaves sent shockwaves through the United Kingdom. The justice system was thrown into turmoil, and the media could hardly keep up with the unfolding chaos. Overnight, what had been considered a closed case became one of the greatest mysteries in modern British crime history. Forensic scientists, detectives, and lawyers were all summoned to re-examine the evidence that had once condemned Daniel to life imprisonment. If Clara was alive, then whose body had been buried under that patch of cement behind the Hargreaves' old garden? The answer came only after days of frantic investigation. Forensic experts returned to the original reports and began comparing old DNA records with new samples taken from Clara. That was when a small, easily overlooked note in the case files changed everything. The first DNA match from the remains had been described as conclusive, but only because there had been no other close family members to test against. The remains shared almost identical genetic markers to Clara's, a near-perfect match. But near-perfect wasn't perfect. When investigators looked deeper into Clara's background, they uncovered something that had never been made public. She had a twin sister named Evelyn. Evelyn had disappeared when she was 19, long before Clara met Daniel. Her parents had spoken little of her, believing she had run away and wanted no contact. Clara had carried the pain of that loss quietly, never mentioning it to anyone in Ashcombe. When the remains were first discovered, no one had even thought to ask about siblings. The DNA was so similar that the experts at the time were convinced it could only be Clara. The horrifying truth was that the body under the garden wasn't the murdered wife. It was her long-lost sister, missing for over 20 years. Meanwhile, Clara's story of survival emerged in fragments. She had fled Ashcombe the night of their final argument, terrified of Daniel's temper. She had taken a small bag of clothes, a bit of money, and left in the middle of the storm. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even her colleagues. When she heard later that police were searching for her, she panicked. She thought Daniel might have blamed her for something, or that the village would turn against her. She changed her name, found work in northern England, and started a new life. For a decade, she lived quietly, haunted by memories she tried to forget. It was only when she saw a documentary about the murder of Clara Hargreaves that she realized the horrifying mistake. Her sister's remains had been mistaken for hers, and Daniel had been convicted of killing her. The guilt of knowing an innocent man was in prison for her death drove her to come forward. But the situation wasn't as simple as she expected. While she had survived, Daniel was far from innocent. The evidence of violence and lies was still undeniable. He hadn't killed her, but he had destroyed her life. The press called it the ghost wife case. Reporters questioned how the system could fail so completely, how one error could ruin so many lives. For Clara, the return to Ashcombe brought back more than memories. It reopened wounds she had buried deep, and for Daniel, the revelation was almost unbearable. He had built his guilt and identity around the belief that he had ended her life, only to learn he had spent 10 years in prison for a crime that wasn't what it seemed. The truth had come to light, but it brought no peace, only more darkness, more confusion, and a haunting question that lingered over everyone who heard the story. If Daniel hadn't killed Clara, what really happened that night? After the shocking revelation, Daniel Hargreaves was released from prison pending a full review of his case. The news spread rapidly, and once again Ashcombe became the focus of national attention. Cameras gathered outside the prison gates as Daniel walked out after 10 long years behind bars. But freedom was not a triumph for him. It felt like stepping into another kind of prison. He looked older, frail and hollow-eyed, like a man who had lost more than time. There were no friends waiting for him, no family to greet him, and certainly no joy in his release. The world he once knew had moved on without him. He was given temporary accommodation in a small flat on the outskirts of Bristol, paid for by a charity that supported wrongfully convicted prisoners. But Daniel's case didn't fit neatly into that category. Yes, he hadn't murdered Clara, but the truth of what he had done was still murky. The court's decision to release him was based on technical grounds, not innocence. Investigators still believed he had been violent toward his wife and may have played a role in her disappearance, even if her death hadn't occurred. Yet without evidence, they could do nothing more. Daniel lived in a strange limbo, free, but still chained to the weight of suspicion. For weeks he barely left his flat. He ignored calls from journalists and refused to meet with anyone from the legal team handling his appeal. His days passed in silence, his only company a collection of old photographs of Clara that he had kept hidden for years. He would sit for hours staring at her face, as if trying to recognize the woman he once loved. There were nights when he thought he heard her voice again, soft, familiar, calling his name from somewhere behind the walls. Then, one afternoon, Clara came to see him. The meeting was quiet, without cameras or reporters, arranged privately through the authorities. She arrived dressed in black, her expression unreadable. When she stepped into the small room, Daniel looked up from his chair, but didn't speak. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, 2 lives destroyed by a single night of anger and fear. Clara's eyes were tired but steady. She didn't show hatred, only sorrow. Daniel, unable to hold her gaze for long, looked away. The silence between them said everything words never could. When she finally left, Daniel remained seated, staring at the empty space she had occupied. That evening, he wrote a brief note and placed it beside the photographs. It said only one line: "She came back, but I never did." Days later, neighbors complained of a strange smell from his flat. The police forced entry and found Daniel lifeless on the floor. There was no sign of struggle, just peace, as if he had quietly drifted away. News of his death barely made headlines. The world had already moved on to newer scandals, fresher tragedies. In Ashcombe, the red brick house where it all began remained abandoned, its garden overrun once again with weeds. Some locals said that on misty mornings, a woman's figure could sometimes be seen standing by the shed, staring at the earth, as though searching for something that could never be found. The story of Daniel and Clara Hargreaves faded into local legend, a haunting reminder that truth can be stranger than any lie, and that some graves are not dug in the ground, but in the human soul.